Okay, we're going to start with a bit of a review because the material last week really wasn't clear and I think it was a little bit confusing. So we're going to start at the very beginning. What is composition? Well, composition has two parts. One is the actual things that it's composed of, its constitution, and the other part is the process of combining those distinct parts and elements to form a unified whole. And we said that this is an iterative process in that we loop through it and that we look at what we have inside of it and how it works. And then we said that the parts, for the most part in a visual design, are the points, the lines, the value, that is the lightness, the darkness, texture, which we can make from points and lines and from value, a notan, which is a notion of negative space, but a much stronger notion of negative space. The word is Japanese, and it really shows us how important it is for our design. And then the last thing is color, but we said color we're going to talk about later. So that covered that, and that was pretty clear, I think. Then we get to the part that's less clear, that composition is the combining of distinct parts to create a whole. And then basically, if you look around at books on composition, you get a set of guidelines that don't really make a lot of coherent sense if you look at them individually. Because if you look at these rules and then you look at the picture and you think about the many ways in which we compose things around us, those rules don't seem to make sense most of the time, or all the time anyway. So what really can we say about composition that's really true? Well, first of all, we can ask why we need to make it a unified whole. When you make a picture, it can have many elements in it. It can have, if it's a landscape, it might have the sea, it might have the beach, it might have a boat, it might have the sky, it might have the sun. There's all kinds of elements that can be in it. Why exactly does it need to be unified? The reason that we said, even though this is just a supposition, just a way of thinking about it, is that when we look out at the world, that all the objects that we see in our world, that we can identify as objects, all seem to have an internal structure. And when we look at many objects, how we tell one object from the other is by its internal structure. And further, that it's really hard for us to look at two things at the same time. And we used a real simple but powerful illusion between the old hag and the young woman to show how we could flip back and forth, but we really couldn't look at both at the same time. So what we want to do is create a unified design so we can get people to focus on what we're doing. So focus is why we want them to treat the whole object as a single object so they can focus on it the way that if we look and we're looking for the hag, we're focusing on that aspect of it. Okay, now that we know why, what is it we want people to focus? What is we're trying to make a whole? And it turns out that's the frame. And the frame can be, in the case of architecture, perhaps the whole of your vision, or in the case of a piece of video, the video frame, or a picture, it may be what's inside a literal gilded frame, and that the frame determines this, and that different kinds of frames are going to affect that very differently. And then we made a pretty bold claim and talked about it in terms of some illusions to try to illustrate it, how the subjective reality of any content is determined by its frame, and we're only going to use this example because I think it's extremely strong. And then we come to the really tricky part. How are we going to do this? How are we going to compose things to create a whole? So we went, since frame is the most important, then maybe the most important decision we can make is how we choose our frame, whether it's log or square or thin or thick. In fact, we can even pick ovals or triangles or any shape we want. But most of the time, we can't really choose. Like for instance, here with this video, the size is already determined for us. If you're working with web design, the size is determined for you. So if we can't choose our frame, or we've already chosen our frame, what do we do then? Well, one way is how we size the objects that we place upon it. You can see these three lines give a very different effect based on their size and their placement. So those are really something to do with proportion. And we go, hang on, let's go back to those guidelines we have. And most of those guidelines seem to have something to do with placement. Is there any way that we can use placement and size to create a unified whole? So let's revisit our rule of thirds, and I think it'll make it a little bit more clear what we do here. So we looked at the rule of thirds as a grid over this frame, the frame of our video here. And we saw that what it does is it creates little boxes, and each box is the same shape as the overall frame. And right away, that immediately creates a relationship between the frame and the exterior. And then the interesting thing is there's another level too. If we place something, as is suggested, over one of these lines here, we get another box. So now we have two relationships. We have a smaller and a larger, and we get a lot of interest, and it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Lots of cameras, lots of video cameras, lots have a rule of threes over them to help you with compose. But the problem is not that it doesn't work, but that it's kind of limited, and it doesn't leave us with a lot of variety and surprise. Then we looked at a set of examples from Africa that use a completely different principle. And you can see here it's a fractal principle in which each time, each part is a little miniature version of the part before, and this can go up and down in space, and this makes for extremely interesting design. And yet, really, this is the same thing going on in the rule of threes, except for the rule of threes doesn't have a structure that's this complex and this deep inside it. So what kind of shape could we use that works out to be a rectangle that has this structure? And then we went, great, there is a structure like that we can use with rectangles, since in our culture we generally find ourselves confronted with rectangles as frames. And it turns up in art, it turns up in nature, we even use it as a way of measuring our own physical beauty in the West. Great! But then we hit the snag, and the snag is the frame, because the frame didn't go away because we got this great idea. And when we can choose the frame, great, we can choose a golden rectangle and we can use all its lovely features. But what happens when we can't? And even though the golden mean makes beautiful rectangles and beautiful forms, if you use those without paying attention to the frame, the result is really hard to look at, and your eye can't quite focus because it's not seeing the whole frame as a whole unified object. And on the other side, we take the elements and we use the proportions of the frame, and we get a better result. And if that wasn't complicated enough, when we're composing what we think is a very simple looking image up above, in fact, when it is stable, actually has a lot of other structures in it. And when we look down below, we see there are multiple squares that correspond with how the image is broken up, and that creates a unified whole. So even though the image up top looks very simple, in point of fact, it's quite complex underneath. But those things happen unconsciously, and for the most part, we don't notice them. So since we figured out that, the frame is really important, and using diagonals, we learned a couple of techniques to take apart any given form. In this case, we did it with our overall frame. We discovered that not only can you have proportion that has to do with shape, but you also have something that, for our purposes, we're going to call relational proportion, the comparison between one and the other. And we can see this wonderful process, very much like the Nautilus shell, happening. It seems like we have some elements, we have some tools, we have some guidelines, but the one thing we don't have is a strategy, is a plan. And at its heart, that's what composition is really about. And that's what we're going to talk about next.